This is the first part of a two-part session, and primarily today we're going to be looking at admissions to nursery and primary school, as well as admissions to a consideration of how you make decisions about schools. Yes, and what data and thoughts and ideas and notes that we can make on that. As for, I know many parents are interested in selective school admission, the preparation for that, and the finer details of those admissions policies around the Midlands. They will be covered in more detail in the next session, although certainly any specific questions, that you're not barred from asking them today. To start off with, children are, of course, an extremely precious part of our lives. Yes, going back to that day when you first had your baby, you want to do absolutely everything you can for them. And as parents, we have many thoughts and ambitions for our children, and it's really worth unraveling them, I think, to start off with in our own mind. And exactly, what I think is best for my children may not be what you think is best for yours. And so many of the decisions that we make in our children's lives and education and where they spend the vast majority of their waking hours for the vast majority of the week in their very formative years is a very vital and emotive decision. So I need to sort of go deep inside us and say, what is it that I want for my child? And there's something else that I'm going to say, which, you know, I hope nobody takes the wrong way. It's just from my experience. We also need to separate out at this point our own ego or any of our own ambitions from our child. And some of you will understand what I mean when I'm saying that. A child cannot and will never be an extension of our ego or a trophy to show others that they have achieved X, Y, Z. We, uh, need to feel comfortable with our own life and our own achievements first, and then we're in a position of just, unconditional love, I guess, that a parent has for their child. We're then in a position to look at our child unemotively and say, what is the best thing for my child? What do I really want for my child? Now, you know, a lot of you might say happiness, we want them to be happy. Yes, but that's it's a very, very general term. The word happy is a very basic and simple term. So we need to go a little deeper. You might say that I want my child to do some good in this world. I want my child to use their one and precious life to make it worth living, to be in a position where they can be a lamp and a ladder for other people. That might be your hope. As a part of that, you may have dreams of leadership and a leadership position for your child. You may want your child to be financially comfortable and not struggling. And that's certainly a perfectly noble hope for a child. Yes, that they would not be indebted or struggling, that they would have enough. And in order to do that, particularly for this generation and in this time and in this country, which is no longer the financial superpower it may have once been, we do need to think quite carefully about, the academic education of children, their qualifications, and their ability, therefore, to live a comfortable life. You might have other dreams. You might want them to be a millionaire. You want them to do this or that. But I think it's worthwhile just stopping and maybe after the session, taking up a piece of paper and saying, no matter how young your child, what is it that you actually want for them in terms of fulfillment? What really matters to you? And many parents that I speak to, having some form of moral education, moral understanding, moral grounding remains really important as well. So that brings us on to the first stage, I guess, of a child's education. Of course, the first stage is earlier than nursery. It's the minute they're born. And studies have tragically really shown us that by the time a child starts nursery at 3, the blueprint for their life is in the vast majority of cases set out by their first 2, 3 years of their early experience of life. So some children will be exposed to a large amount of vocabulary, high level discussion, having books read to them, poetry, good quality programs on in the background, discussions. They will have had a home that is relatively harmonious. Yeah, there's no such thing as fairy tales, but a reasonably harmonious home where, there was no great element of stress, difficulty, or conflict, and that, of course, will affect the child's development. Some children will have had adequate nutrition. Some children would have had exceptionally good nutrition. They will have been powered up with superfoods and, yes, kale and avocado from a young age. And some children in our country will be malnourished and not receive an adequate amount of nutrition. We do have malnourished children in our cities, in our country, who are significantly small for their age due to malnourishment as well. And so by the time your British child turns 2 or 3, so much has already been set. And I suppose from us here, all of us being interested parents who want to do the very best, the child's development, the way they talk, the way they're raised, the progress that they make in those early development stages can obviously be helped very much by having caregivers who give them attention. By caregiver, I'm not going to be specific. I'm certainly no Stepford wife who's telling you that mum has to be there for 3 years full time. That's not always the best way for mum or baby or the family. But obviously having a caregiver, so we're looking for a nursery, looking for those with older, mature staff. We're looking for a childminder, looking for those who will not be spending the day on their mobile phone, but who will be giving the children the support, the interaction, the discussion, the talking that they need for that very vital early development. And then, of course, we have a lot of children who can speak 2 or 3 languages, and studies have shown that that is not an academic disadvantage at all. In fact, it helps the child academically to be exposed to so many different languages, dialects, words, even from a very young age. Indeed. So we're thinking about values, our raising of our child, and then we get to the point where perhaps we're choosing an educational setting, such as a nursery. And what I'm going to say throughout this, of course, some of you will already know this, so bear with me. Use it as information to help others, and some of you may even be relatively new to the UK and you might find this really useful. The nursery system is a really interesting system. You can go and choose from the age of 3, the term after your child turns 3. So if your child is 3 in December, they can start nursery in January. If your child turns 3 in May, they can start nursery in the September. Interesting way of doing things, but there are state-funded nurseries. You simply send your child there, you get 5 half days a week. In many postcodes in Birmingham, funding is available for 5 full days a week as part of a program with the intention of trying to help and support children in their early years. Then, of course, you can make the decision to go to a private nursery, any private nursery, anywhere pretty much, or to the private nursery class of an independent private school. And up until your child is in the reception year, the term after they turn 4, then you will receive a grant, a funding grant that will go towards that. And in many cases, you'll have to top that up to a small or greater amount, depending on how many hours your child goes to that nursery. And it's quite interesting thinking about what a child needs from a nursery. Just like schools, there are good and bad nurseries out there. And ultimately, this is a really vital moment in a child's development, particularly if they've been extremely attached to just one caregiver and now have to be essentially sort of pulled away to go to a very different environment. And different children will settle into different environments in very different ways. It is at this point, this vital point, that the child's whole learning outlook is determined. Their experience of that nursery, any feelings of stress that they undergo within that nursery, if, for example, they are not being looked after adequately or given the attention from perhaps the teenagers who are working in the nursery. When I was years ago, my children are all a bit older now, looking for nurseries and visited so many, and you do need to visit quite a few unless you've got something through strong recommendation. It amazed me that the majority of them seem to have staff who were under 20. And that's not to say that somebody under 20 cannot be a wonderful caregiver, but in many cases, they just don't have the maturity and the focus and the experience. And for me personally, I chose nurseries where the staff were literally in their 50s and 60s. Funnily enough, there were actually more expensive nurseries. So that ability for the child to explore and to move forward and to play is absolutely vital. Um, there's one documentary that I recommend that every single parent must watch, and it's a very old documentary. It was a Panorama or Dispatches. It was one or the two. You can find it on YouTube. I will give the link to Kathleen later. You can see the whole documentary there, and it's called Too Much Too Soon. And this documentary is fascinating, and the findings of it are borne out by rigid uh, Cambridge University studies as well. The findings were that formal education, sitting at a desk, completing a formal reading and writing curriculum, what I'm going to say will shock you, is detrimental before the age of 6 or 7. That was actually the findings of the documentary. And what has not obviously been included in British education policy, but has been concluded as a result of numerous very, very stringent studies, is that this is the case. It's quite interesting. From my position tutoring children over well over a decade, I've seen a change in the children that come through as the national curriculum has changed, as the early years foundation stage, this is for children who are only 3, 4, 5, has become far more rigid. I remember once tragically, I went to an education fair at the NEC, and there was a big stall there. In front of the stall were all sorts of devices and contraptions and things to put on your hand and your finger and on the page, and you know, to help children, small children, to write. And the lady behind the stall was giving a demonstration, holding up, these rubber things and things that strap to your fingers and all the other things she had on the stall. She said that we all know that the hands of 4 and 5-year-olds are in general not fully developed enough to grip a pencil, to hold it correctly and firmly, and to be able to write neatly. We all know this. So here are all of the things you can strap to their hands and strap to the pencil and strap to the desk in order to try to force the poor children to do this. So what have I experienced as a tutor as a result of this early years emphasis on very, very early writing is that now I have a significant number of pupils whose writing is near illegible, or who struggle to write, who are finding writing stressful and don't like it, and they're slower at writing than they should be at the age of 9 or 10. And I would trace that down to, sometimes we can do things too late, sometimes we can do things too soon, those early years. In contrast, if you take something like a Montessori approach, and I have recommended this, quite a few of my pupils who really struggle with handwriting have seen an enormous difference in taking this early years Montessori approach, which is you buy them tweezers, you buy them chopsticks, you get little things, small things, beans, and things like that, little beads, and they learn to take them from one bowl to the other, yes? Or they develop their finger strength and their fine motor skills in other ways. But what we're essentially doing at the age of 9 or 10 here is trying to make up for what happened in the early years, because once the child has learned to grip a pen, and previously children used to hold a pen like this, but now I have many children who hold a pen like this. They genuinely sit, and sometimes they can write quite neatly. Yes, but it's quite a strain and it's not comfortable. Anyway, I'm digressing, but I'm saying stop. And just to look at this documentary, look at the research, and what they found was that European children, particularly Eastern European children who do not start school until 7, in fact, most countries, you'd be surprised to know, don't start school until 6 or 7. In Iran, which has a very high academic score in global world academic scores, children don't start school till 7. Dickens started school at the age of 9. Shakespeare started school at the age of 8. Yes, you see where I'm going. And if you have a look at some old letters, even those sent by soldiers in World War One, for example, to their love back in England, the handwriting is exquisitely neat. And that's because they didn't start school until they were 7. So let's just sort of take things to the side and have a look at our approaches, our values, what matters. I think the idea also of emotional well-being and mental health was not something that people thought about in a great deal of detail 10 years ago. But now, and I think particularly with the pandemic, we are starting to think about this and choose schools that actively support and help children to build habits and understanding of their own emotional well-being. So if you're making notes on questions to ask nurseries and schools, that would certainly be one of them. But now that I've sort of moved on from nursery, let's have a think about primary school. And that is a really sort of big level of decision that we make for children. So I'm just going to share a screen with you here at the moment. I know that this session was advertised as talking about choice in school admissions. And the tragic thing is, as I'm sure you know, choice is limited. It's like the choice I give my children. Would you like to fill the dishwasher or hoover the lounge? It's a choice. It is a choice. There's not a lot of choice. There's not a lot of free will coming into play here. And all of us as parents will have felt this. Choice in most cases in the UK and many other education systems is related to finances and income. So if we have a look at how children are admitted to primary school, obviously the vast majority of children will go to state-funded primary schools, with an absolutely tiny percentage in comparison going to fee-paying independent schools. But I will look at both. And when it comes to school admissions to a good primary school, in the vast majority of cases, it will be done on distance, your location, your proximity to the school. And it's no secret that there are some schools that don't follow this pattern, certainly. But in most cases, wealthier areas with more expensive housing tend to be located next to schools that are better schools in many respects. And that's the reality of a system that you could argue is unjust. Lots of things have been done to try to change that system, but it remains as it is. When parents or anybody you know, relatives, are making decisions about buying a house, the proximity to schools, school catchment areas, understanding school catchment areas, which vary vastly through localities and authorities, remains really, really important. And it's certainly the case that there are many families who choose to live in a smaller home in order to, of course, be in a better school catchment, yeah, because that's how the house prices work. The other school admissions that is quite important is religion, because of course we still have a great many Catholic schools who will select on basis of faith and induction into that faith, such as a baptism. There's Church of England schools. There are a small number of Muslim and Jewish schools as well who will select ultimately by giving priority to those who follow a particular religion. And it is a real conundrum, actually, for me, when I really think about it. I know of some areas, I can think of some areas in Birmingham where, at risk of sounding quite harsh by using this word, there's an effective apartheid system in place with a Christian Authority Foundation school containing the white children and the other community school containing the Asian children. This is a reality in a number of Birmingham suburbs, and it's actually a bit tragic because it affects our ability from a young age to access the enrichment of being exposed to children of different faiths, different backgrounds, different ethnicities, different cultures, different home languages. That is an incredible enrichment in the life of a child. And by segregating our schools according to religion, we're not really helping that. We're not really helping our overall long-term community cohesion. That's my opinion, and you may disagree, but you have every right to do so. And then it brings us to the idea that, you know, some religions, if you go back, if you even to when I was brought up as a Catholic, so even when I go back to being a child, I went to Catholic school. There was an element of marginalization there. IRA was doing its bombs and so on. And now we have, for example, Muslim children sometimes feeling marginalized within the school system or not taken care of, or their needs not being met. So they have therefore gone and set up the Muslim schools. It's a really, really difficult conundrum. And there's no doubt that there are some schools who are very open and caring of all children and actually show respect, and that's a very strong word, respect, to children's faith. And really, from an ethical point of view, a teacher must show respect to a child's faith. Is it ethical to say to a Jewish child, Jesus is the Son of God? Is that ethical? Is that the right thing to do in your position of power as a teacher when you know that in their faith, they don't believe that? Yes, but unfortunately, ethics don't always come into play. And so we really need to, you know, if our faith or our culture is very important to us, or things like dietary requirements, then doing that research and really following through is absolutely vital. When my eldest son, who's now 22, was at primary school, and his brother, who's 20, I drove them. I lived in what is, in fairness, a deprived inner city area of Birmingham, and I drove them to a village school on the very, very outskirts of Coventry. It was about a 50-minute drive, yeah, which I did through 2 pregnancies as well. I drove them there, and quite fascinatingly, there were actually 4 Muslims in the school. My 2 boys and another 2 boys who were both brothers as well. I cannot fault the respect that they showed. My eldest son, from the age of 7, would pray 5 times a day. He would take out his prayer mat. They supported him absolutely. In fact, they got him to do a display to the school, showing them the prayer mat and showing them how he prayed. And they had no problems at all whatsoever. The respect was there. Yeah, the ability for my children to grow and to develop as children without feeling other, without feeling lesser, was there. But I'm also aware of schools within Birmingham, funnily enough, that actively will prevent children from doing their obligatory prayers when they need to, even though they're good children or not harming anybody, or who will perhaps actively do things that make that child feel other or lesser. And that's really important because that feeling of belonging is important. And I'm going to go a little bit philosophical here and take you back to, well over 20 years ago when I worked for Interfaith in Bradford. And this is way before 9/11 or anything like that. And what we had in Bradford was quite fascinating because there was a genuine issue, believe me, genuine issue with the youth turning to extremism, Islamic extremism. It was genuine. And they were joining extremist groups, groups that would later feed into groups such as Al-Qaeda. This was major. And what I saw was that the children who went to schools, we're talking about secondary age children here, who had a prayer room, who allowed them to express themselves, who respected who they were not joining these groups at all. But the children who went to schools where prayer was banned, where they were not accepted, where they were forced to sing this and do this prayer and, you know, left the children in such a conundrum in terms of their identity, that it was those schools that were feeding the extremist groups. It's really fascinating. So in terms of looking at a school that supports your child and supports who they are and respects who they are, well, that's really important, because, and that's the case, not just, I'm talking about Muslims here from my own experience, but that would be the case with any group, with any religion, and particularly, of course, with Black children, and particularly with Black boys, because the statistics show us that Black boys are far more likely, for example, to have things like detentions and exclusions from the school, and far less likely to, for example, be viewed upon or treated fairly, and lots of ideas with that. So academic ability doesn't really come into play in primary school admissions unless it's private schools who may check academic ability or do some sort of assessment or interview with the child. But obviously it's certainly within Birmingham and Walsall and Warwickshire comes into play when it comes to secondary school admissions. Ability to pay fees is vital. It's just, it's there. Some parents can buy themselves a far better education, but the cost of private school for most ordinary families is completely out of reach. It really is, particularly if we've got a number of children. And we also, it's worth mentioning that some of these independent schools around Birmingham and Walsall, Lichfield, and other places do offer scholarships and assisted places even at primary level. And I've known children to go to these schools on a fully free place, depending obviously in that case on their ability. So applications can be made if you feel that you've got a very bright child who would benefit a lot from that. And then of course school admissions also centre around special needs of a child, and particularly statements of special needs or disabilities. If a child there are different levels within the school system of classification of special needs. And the pretty much highest level is where a child has a statement, a written statement of their needs. And usually statemented children will be prioritized in first position for the school that is listed on their statement. So for example, a child may have mobility needs, they may be in a wheelchair. Their statement will list a school that is all on one floor or has a lift, and the child has to be prioritized for that. And then of course we have special schools that cater for children with specific and varying needs within those schools. And again, that is a quite different admissions process to the usual admissions process, and you will have an actual key worker from the council if your child has a statement, who will work with you. As for the other levels of special needs, if a child doesn't have a statement, and many children do have some element of special needs without a statement, it is pretty much up to you as a parent to make those inquiries, to discuss with the school, to find out what they will think. For example, one of my children is autistic spectrum condition. And it was quite interesting. He's at a grammar school, he's academically able. But at my point of choosing a school, I rang around the schools and I spoke to them and I said, I'd like to speak to your special educational needs and disabilities coordinator. And only one school got back to me. It's the one he's at the moment. But the deafening silence from the others, their refusal to really entertain the thought of discussing this with the parent prospective to admission, was interesting. So it's really important. Some schools will cater better for special needs than others. Some are just more compassionate. And that's where it becomes really tricky, because you're almost having to be Sherlock Holmes here. And try to detect, because every school is going to say, we're a happy, caring, inclusive, wonderful school. They all say that. But some are more happy, caring, and inclusive than others. Right? And it's a matter of, asking other parents, finding out, speaking to the teachers, trying to get as much information, visiting the school as much as possible. Something very difficult, obviously, in the current lockdown. So deciding on a school, I think we have covered quite a bit. I'm not sure if I should stop. It's becoming quite a long monologue. You might be losing focus. Maybe, I'm not sure if there are any questions that I should take before I move on to the admissions timetable and deadlines.
That would be really good, I think, if we have a little break here, because you've covered a lot of information and a lot going on. And I think people are really absorbing it in. So if anybody has any questions, I don't see anything in the chat. If people have questions, can you please either post in chat or take off your mic and unmute yourself, I should say, and ask Rebecca now before we move on to help. It's been wonderful talking about the importance of choosing a school and looking at your values and looking at needs. And actually, similar to Rebecca, I did a lot of that driving as well with my children. In the when we lived up north before we moved down to the primary school that I thought was the best for them. Being a country Irish girl myself, I chose a more country type school for them, that environment that I loved, even though we were not living in a city or a town, we were living on the edge of it. So I had I suppose, a bit more of a choice there. And in those days, it was a little bit easier, I think, than now. But I think it is important to, if you are able to actually do that research and look and see what school suits you, your family, your values, the way you perceive your children to get their education, and try and meet their needs as best as possible. So I'm just repeating a lot of what Rebecca has mentioned. There's still no questions come in. Anybody want to take off their mic and join in the conversation? I will unmute myself now and let you.
Okay. So when asking questions, I think it's easier to put it as a chat to everybody. But I have received a direct message, which is how to compare between grammar school and private school. I guess that's going on to, secondary school admissions more. Um, Again, how to compare with one school and the other, it's extremely difficult. And the first thing that we need to do is we take a piece of paper and say, what do I want for my child? What is important for my child? What is my child like? And within a family, no children are identical either. But what do they need? What is their real ability? Are they the sort of child who just enjoys studying? They sit at their desk, they just enjoy learning, they enjoy studying, they just keep giving them workbooks, they keep doing them. Yes, relatively focused learner, enjoys reading. Or do I have a child who, perhaps despite being very academically able, needs a very heavy structure and push behind them? Do I have a child with some form of special needs? Or do I have a child who perhaps, for various reasons, bereavement early in life, family difficulties or issues, the illness of a parent, may need a little bit more emotional support in school? Do I have a child who's very sporty and wants to be at a school where lots of sports are on offer, or a child who's very musical and they need to be in a school with an amazing orchestra, a school where they can feel they belong and takes them forward? And you know what? I'm going to slightly divert because I really, at this point, wanted to get up a quote. I'm just going to try to find it in my drive. Yeah, I found it. Last week, as some of you know, I completed a course on Harry Potter with Cambridge University. And it was really challenging. So I did a crazy amount of reading for that. And Harry Potter's another story. But my tutor, who's also an author himself, was John Leonard. And what I'm going to do actually is I'm going to share with you. I just literally, John Leonard sent this to me, and I'm taking the liberty of showing it to you. He sent it to me as a personal message because we were having a discussion about, J.K. Rowling said, for those of you who know Harry Potter, that she saw herself in Hermione. She saw herself as a very academically able child, perhaps somewhat removed from the rest of the pupil body due to her ability, and she sort of made that character. For me, thinking about myself as a girl at school, very, very similar experience. Despite the fact that I went to an independent private school on a scholarship, it was still element of being a SWAT, being a nerd we have in our school system. And that's perhaps particularly more so in primary schools as well. And actually going beyond that is quite interesting. And then you asked me about the difference between grammar and private school, or the difference between this school or that school, and why I actually still believe, despite its inequity, that academic selection can be a really, really good way forward for many children. This is what John Leonard said: the conspiracy in schools against intellectual thought is striking. And while not only English, very English, you'd actually find this in other countries as much. We say we value learning, but in truth, we don't much. In no other European nation is intellectual derogatory. In no other European language can one say of too bloody clever by half or so sharp he'll cut himself. Words that certainly I recognize a lot from my northern upbringing. Our deep anti-intellectualism seems to date to the post-Civil War, the 17th century, the 1600s. For those of you aware of that history, there was a lot of theological dogmatism and hair splitting. You had the Puritans and had the Cavaliers, and it had wreaked terrible havoc. So in the 18th century, there was a sort of backlash against intellectualism. John Bull emerged, not foolish, mythological, fictional character really, but with a certain shrewdness, but none of the intellectual, cosmopolitan, stubborn ideas. You know, this is vital when we're talking about schools, because I think we need to know what we are dealing with here. Amongst the pupil body, there is a real worry. This is why I think sometimes within my classes, there is a haven for bright children, a place where they could come and just be bright, be amazing without, look at that nerd, she's a swat, a nerd, a swat, a nerd, a swat, going on in the background in the primary school. When it comes to grammar and independent schools, it really depends which grammar school as well, because we've got grammar schools that are highly selective. They just select on ability. For example, currently, but they may be changing criteria in a little while. Currently, Kes Stratford and Stratford Girls' School remain pretty highly, widely selective, and the scores to get in are therefore high. Bishop Vesey's and Sutton Coldfield Girls, Queen Mary's Grammar for boys, Queen Mary's High for girls remain widely selective and ultimately just take children on score, top score down, and then the level of the last score is the final level in. And then, of course, you have the very recent changes to the King Edward VI schools, which won't have filtered through because it's very recent. The current year 7 are the first ones to have really gone in on the new system. Whereby they have catchment areas made up of very specific areas in Birmingham, and they have a priority score, which this year is 223. And anybody in the catchment above that priority score should, in theory, get a place. And if you got 270 or 223, it really doesn't matter. It's just on whether you're in catchment and proximity on the score. So therefore, we can't really call them super selective schools anymore. Remembering that previously to get into Camp Hill Boys, you would have needed a minimum of 249, which is a pretty exceptional score. For that to have changed to 223 is a significant change. And so then we're seeing our independent schools change. Kes, Edgbaston, KHS Edgbaston, Solihull School, even other independent schools are slightly raising their academic level, actually significantly raising the academic level in case of some of them as a result of this. So, you know, choosing between grammar and independent, it's primarily a financial decision, isn't it? Yes, and you know how much you feel that the 13K a year is worth to make the school better than the grammar school for your child, and it's a very deep and personal decision. Somebody asked if your child has autism or something else needing extra attention, what are the questions to ask? It's a good question. So off the top of my head, it would be, you know, watching the reaction. My child has autism spectrum condition. What do you have in place to cater for children like that? And the rest of your questions will deal with the needs of your child. So, for example, some children with ASC will really struggle with a high level of stimulation, overstimulation, noise, sound, smell, lights. They'll find it very hard to go through that, and it may lead to a meltdown, and that meltdown may take many different forms: running away, um, actually physically, shouting or having a meltdown, or simply being very silent and going into themselves because they're in such extreme stress because they cannot process the information that's coming into them, that they become catatonic. So every child is going to work through that in different ways. And I know that, for example, a school might say, we'll give them a card, sometimes called a get out of jail free card. Show the teacher the card, and you can go off to the quiet room or the sensory room, the room with some cushions. You can have that break. Not all schools do that, however. Not all schools do that. And then other things in terms of teachers' understanding. A lot of it does depend on not just what the SENDCO says, but the overall attitude of the teachers in the school. One of my sons is deaf. I use that word advisedly. It's just generally in the deaf community. I'm deaf myself. Generally, we don't use the word hearing impaired anymore, even though I can hear you with my hearing aids on. I can hear you with this. This is perfect. And one of my sons had the same condition, was deaf, or what was then known as obviously hearing impaired. Um, I cannot fault the SENDCO of his school. She was brilliant. She worked tirelessly. But if you've got teachers who don't want to wear the radio aid because they don't like it, or don't want to repeat what other children in the class said because they just don't want to and it disturbs the lesson, so your child is left wondering what the discussion is about, then you've got another hurdle to go across. And that whole ethos and attitude and the way in which taking care of SEND children is enforced um, really varies from school to school, which is why sort of getting as much deep information as you possibly can about it helps. But yes, sort of putting the ball in the school's court and saying, what do you have in place? What will you do? How will you work through this? Will you just go through the perfunctory motions, or are you actually willing to include my child in your school? That's really important. Okay, I've got a message about Catholic Church schools. Is this type of school good for Muslim? Every school is different. Every single Catholic school is different, the different ethos, and will behave in a different way. So you can't lump schools into that's Catholic, that's Church. Yeah, you have to sort of talk about this with the head and say, say things. Every time my child went to school, I said, my child needs to pray. My child, for example, needs to pray Friday prayers. Or my child will, when they're older, fast in Ramadan, and watch their reaction. It usually tells you quite a lot. Yes, in the same way that, inclusivity and compassion starts from the very, very top up. Generally, if your head teacher is inclusive and compassionate, you will find that trickles down to the staff, not in all cases, and then you will find that trickles down to the children. Where we've had horrific cases, there was a recent case, a horrific case of bullying that you will have seen on the news, where a Sikh boy had his turban ripped off. Um, you do have to go into that school and say, where did they lose the compassion to allow not one child, not two children, but an entire group of children to think that that was okay? Where did the compassion get lost? And so where is that compassion? And we've got, of course, the tragic case in Manchester of a little girl who supposedly drowned, and the way in which the school ethos was, the way in which bullying was not dealt with. I think that we possibly as parents put up with a lot, and that is particularly the case in poorer communities. I knew of one parent whose son was stabbed at school, um, in a school in Birmingham, and that required obviously hospitalization. The response to the school was basically cover it up, very little done for the bullies, and carry on, and we do have to ask ourselves just how much we're going to stand for before we walk away. I would never feel afraid to take a child out of a school to a better environment. I don't think that's particularly harmful for a child. I've done that with my children. One of my children was severely bullied in one school. I did pick him up one day with blood over his face. Of course, I was told that, it was an accident, yeah, and there was no real consequences for the child who did that. And I took him out of school. Simple as that. Yes. I think to have continued would have been more detrimental ultimately. So I think we do have to stand for something. So we'll fall for nothing. Um, yeah. Any more questions I'm willing to take, or I can sort of zoom on with the discussion, share the screens. So in terms of admissions deadlines. This is, of course, for the current academic year, applying for places in September. The admissions deadline for secondary school places passed. It is a national continuous deadline of the 31st of October. You will usually receive the offer on the 1st of March, but if the 1st of March is a Saturday or Sunday, you'd receive it on the next Monday. You need to accept that offer by the 15th of March. That's this year's. Sometimes every year can change slightly there. For primary reception place in September, your deadline is passed. The application was by the 15th of January. The offer was given on the 16th of April. You need to refuse by the 30th of April. A very different situation. If you don't refuse, you go down on that school list and you're going to that school. And that's quite interesting because in September, a whole load of children will not turn up at those schools because their parents have found somewhere else, moved house, gone private, and not told the local authority. That's really unfair, actually, because then that leads to other children who've just been bought the uniform for their new school being whipped out and sent to the school at which those parents couldn't be bothered to refuse a place. But that's the system. I'm just going to move on to some really useful resources. Obviously, in terms of your local authority, every local authority will have an admissions website. Birmingham being actually the biggest local authority in Europe, has an enormous website and an enormous amount of schools to look through. If you're towards the boundaries of Birmingham, near any of the other local authorities, have a look at those as well. Many children cross local authority boundaries to go to school successfully. And I just want to talk to you about looking at admissions information. I'm just going to get this up. The amount of information available is quite astounding and enables you to effectively really research and understand your chances of getting into a school as well as the schools. This is Birmingham City Council's admissions page. Lots of information there. I click this. Can you see this where it says school admissions download? You can. And there are so many documents here, if you go to school admissions downloads, that are really useful. One of the useful ones now, of course, is 14 to 19 academies. You'll find these in Walsall, Warwickshire as well. So you can actually move your child for year 10 to a different school that will cater, sometimes quite specifically, for example, Aston Engineering Academy or certain music academies for a child's ability. If I click this one on primary school offers, which comes towards the end, you can see the detail that I can go through on this list. So if I have a look at, say, Acox Green Primary School, the PAN published admissions number is 60. 60 places are offered. That's 2 classes. The offers on criteria. We can see that from this school, 34 children were offered because they had a sibling priority. 26 children were offered on distance, making up, of course, the total of 60 children. There were a total, of course, of 354 preferences for Acox Green Primary School. The cut-off distance is here. You had to live, if you weren't a sibling, within 649 metres of the school. In terms of working out exactly how far you are from a school, Google Maps isn't really the way to go because it doesn't tell you as the crow flies distance. You actually need to sort of ring up or email your admissions authority and say to them, what's my distance from X school, Y school, and Z school, and they will tell you it according to their plan so that you can compare it with the distance here. And then, of course, the top one, which I didn't mention because it's a little bit different, is a faith school, the Abbey Roman Catholic Junior and Infant School. As it says, the cutoff was faith, although interestingly, 27 of those children were actually siblings and 33 were distant. Based on where the Abbey is, in inner city Birmingham, there are not going to be a huge amount of Catholics of that faith probably going to that particular school. So you can access all of this. You can access It can give you an idea. Do you see how big Birmingham Local Authority is? It's enormous. It gives you an idea of your chances of getting into particular schools. If you're buying a house or looking to rent a house in a particular place, it gives you an idea of, what you're going to need to look at to get a place, in the right location. So now I'm just going to share with you another really, really useful resource. And I'm always amazed. Please tell other people about this. Parents tend to go to Ofsted and look at Ofsted. In many cases, Ofsted is crazily out of date. There are schools that I am well aware of that are providing a very poor educational experience, but they've got their Ofsted outstanding from 2006 still on there, which is probably before your child was born. Yeah, it's just too out of date to be very useful in most cases. This isn't out of date, this is useful, although obviously last year we had quite an unusual situation. SATs were cancelled and GCSEs and A-levels, whatever, were judged in a very different way. So here I am I just type in DFE performance tables to Google. It takes me here, and I'm going to look for this one, search by local authority. Okay, and I'm going to click local authority, and I'll type in, I'm not going to type in Birmingham because it's so big. So bear with me if I type in Lichfield. Let's see if that comes up, because I know that's going to be small. Yes, bear with me. It wants me to type Staffordshire. I'm not going to write Staffordshire for it. Okay. So now I'm seeing all schools and colleges in Staffordshire. Birmingham, the list would be too big. And I'm going to look at primary performance. I can sort this table. I could sort it by school name if I wanted an alphabetical list in alphabetical order. I could sort it by type of school. I could sort it by the number of pupils at the end of Key Stage 2, but right now I'm going to sort it by the number of pupils, the percentage of pupils meeting the expected standard. So that's quite interesting. You can see that, well, ultimately the top school here is Anson, Church of England Primary School in Staffordshire. But there were only 14. Staffordshire is not a big place. It doesn't have a very high population density. We've got a whole load of schools here. Look at this one, only 6, with tiny numbers of children in year 6. And we're talking about 2019 here, before the pandemic. So when you've got such tiny numbers, it can be tricky. And a school's results can vary a lot by year, because obviously each child stands for a very significant percentage there. So yes, probably take very, very small schools with a pinch of salt. But as you can see, it's quite straightforward. If I'm interested in reading, if I want my child to go to a school where reading is really well taught and really important, I can click on reading, and I've now sorted the schools by reading, in which St. Paul's comes top, despite only 79% of pupils meeting the expected standard in all areas. Their reading score is well above average, writing is average, maths is well above average. I could also, if I've got an able child and I want them to be in a group of children who are able, look at the percentage of pupils achieving at a higher standard. And then we get to St. Mary's, where in that particular year, remember there's only 15 children there. In that particular year, 47% of pupils achieved at a higher standard. It's nearly half of that 15 were actually well above the national average. Or I could, of course, look at the average score in maths, and that is divided. I can also click on this again, and I've now organized them in terms of average score in maths from the bottom. Well, it's a bit unfair, really, to be putting these special scores here. But if we move on, yeah, we do have these ordinary non-special schools who are at the very bottom of the table there. For example, Doxy Primary and Nursery School with only 29%. We do see figures like this in Birmingham as well. Some schools with only 14% of the children in the whole year group achieving the basic expected standard to go on to secondary school. There's something else that we learnt from here, and that is that there is a possibility for us of casting our net a little wider and thinking about places that are maybe off the beaten track for our children. I'm pretty sure that with some of these schools, the numbers are so small. You could apply to St Andrew's C of E Primary School if you really wanted to, because it's quite obvious that with 9 in year 6, they've got spaces for your child. Okay, so this table, I have no idea where it is, by the way. It's probably in the north, Tamworth. It's in Tamworth. Just, outstanding Ofsted report and so on. And Tamworth, it's relatively easy to get to. There's a train station there. I'm just having some musings here. So you can sort of use the DFE tables to get hold of some genuine, strong, clear information. For many children and for many parents, being able to go to a school in their community with children who are their neighbours is the best thing for them and their parents, and the parents are very happy with that. But in some cases, particularly if the child has specific needs or even is academically very able or has specific special needs, the opportunity to be able to go out of that and find a different school could be useful. I have gone over time.
Well, you well deserve it indeed. I'm shocked at the amount of information there, the amount of information at your fingertips, and how well you can navigate these sites. It's like making it breakfast or making a cup of tea or something, the way you go through them. I'm sure a lot of parents wish they could have these skills, but possibly now, after today's session, they can actually explore these websites and go through them, and in their own ease get used to the website so that they're familiar with it and able to choose the best school. We do have a question. I don't think you've addressed that yet. It came up during your last little presentation there. The secondary school deadline, is it for grammar school also?
Okay, I mean, there's 2 deadlines for application to grammar school. The first one is usually at the beginning of July. It hasn't been set this year. We'll find out when we find out. But it's usually at the beginning of July, and that's the deadline to apply for your child to sit the examination. And then there's the main local authority deadline, which is the 31st of October, by which time you have to have filled in your own local authority form listing your schools in order. You should have your child's grammar school score by then anyway to help you to make an informed decision. Applications for grammar school usually open up in May, and they're usually online. And they open up in May. You go to the website, you make your application. You need to have a few things ready, such as a photograph of your child in a format like a JPEG format that you can attach, and then you apply, and then the final deadline is July. And I am aware of one child a few years ago, their parents forgot to apply. Despite the child having been in tuition for 2 years, the parents forgot to apply for grammar school, and there is no mercy. They will not allow you to apply after that deadline. That's it. So the child is in an independent school now.
Yeah. Thank you for that. And I know next session that we're going to do with you, which we haven't confirmed the date yet, but we will on the WhatsApp group. And I think all our parents are on the WhatsApp group because there was lots of messages there today on the group. It was great seeing you all there. We will pass out that information to you, and we will also be able to answer other questions on that group. So we will have different chats there. If it is something that is very specific for Rebecca, with Rebecca's permission, we can copy and paste some questions to her to be able to respond to, but we need to be mindful of her time. So we'll probably also try and compile them all to have them ready for the next session so that we're using her time effectively indeed, because we're so grateful for her giving up her time today. And we are privileged to have somebody as knowledgeable as this, that we can actually go and seek advice.
But for those who joined late, I think it's worth saying that we're going to primarily be discussing secondary school and selective admission preparation in the next session, not this session. But hopefully this has been useful for everybody, because you're now able to talk to, neighbours and relatives and friends virtually, of course, and tell them about, what we've learned today, and really think. I think it's for all of us as parents, and I'm still learning as a parent. I'm lucky that I had 5 children, so I could make all of my mistakes with the first 4. But I've certainly made mistakes. I've certainly made decisions in my children's life that I have regretted, and we should just really throw off that whole guilt of motherhood and say, at any one time, each one of us is growing, learning, and trying to do our absolute best for our children. So certainly in the discussion that we've had today, I don't want anybody to go away feeling guilty or inadequate for any reason. All of you, the fact that you've just tuned in are clearly completely amazing parents, because I'm sure you're all sick of Zoom already, yes? And now you've voluntarily signed up to watch me on Zoom, which shows a significant amount of commitment to your child. So thank you for joining in.
Thank you, Rebecca, for that and that wonderful reminder. Indeed, we are not just learning from you, we're learning from each other, and our parents teach us so much every time we deliver a parenting course as well, about different issues. We're all learning together, indeed, and that's what we should all be doing every day, not wasting a day from the cradle to the grave. Well, I really just want to thank you for giving up your time, and let us continue this conversation over on the WhatsApp group. Please, we don't need you all to be involved every minute, but we want those conversations to continue so that you are aware and that you're familiar and you know the process, and we're here to try and support you as best we can, hopefully. So,
Yeah.
thank you all, everybody. Have a
Thank
great
you.
day. Wonderful. Thank you. Lovely wave there. Bye bye, and have a good day. Take care. We'll see you in the WhatsApp group.